Thank you. So actually what we're going to do, because Nicola gave us such a brilliantly broad brush topic, we're actually going to sort of home it down a little bit. And actually we're going to talk about tanks sort of at the end of the First World War and the interwar years, and then sort of chew the cud over tanks in the Second World War. And I suspect that will... Well, I mean, if we get beyond 1941, we'll be doing quite well, won't we, in 45 minutes? But anyway, Dick, so we were talking earlier on, weren't we, about how do you get from those big, familiar First World War tanks that we all know and love so well to where we're at in 1939? Because with the exception of the French, with the Char B, I can't think of... There's a few big tanks, but basically tanks seem to have shrunk in the years between. Or is that... am I completely wrong about that?
Yeah, I can answer that in one word. Treasury. But yeah, we often criticise the performance. Let's focus on British tanks during the Second World War. We often criticise the performance of British tanks in the Second World War, and you can't understand those criticisms, and a lot of them are valid. But you can't understand why they come about and why we end up with a range of appallingly poor tanks at the start of the Second World War, without starting probably in 1918. So if you'll forgive me, I'll talk about that for about the first 5 minutes. So I think three things come up from the rhomboid tank, the familiar, I'm sure you can all picture it, the First World War tank. Three things in particular. First of all, it's designed as an infantry support weapon, and that's how most people see it. So the view of the tank as the queen of the battlefield, the dominant weapon, is not in anybody's mind really in 1918, apart from a few hardcore tank war chaps. Second thing about it is a lot of people just want to see the back of the tank at the end of the First World War because they think that it's an aberration, it's not required. The First World War itself was an aberration, so therefore no need for these monstrosities. And the third thing about them is, although it's cutting-edge technology in 1916, 1917, 1918, the tank is basically built out of loads of available components. So you pick the best available engine that you can get, and we build the tank around it. And David, you might want to cut in at this stage, but apart from the design of the tracks of the rhomboid tank, the rest of it is pretty much off-the-shelf machinery.
Yeah, I'd say one other thing I would say at 1918, because just sorry, jumping around the place because we're all getting old men, I'll forget things if I don't say it now. But that business about by the end of the First World War, just out of interest, because we'll come back to it with World War II, is we end up in Britain designing pretty much one of every type of armoured vehicle that sees service in World War II, and I might even argue today. And so that we've got a fast tank, the Whippet, we've got the rhomboid tank, the breakthrough tank supporting the infantry, we've got the first engineer tank, we've got the Mark 9, the first armoured personnel carrier to carry 30 soldiers is being built. And I always go back to the line that where I come from at Bovington, was doubling in size, ready for Plan 1919. So our imagination for the use of the tank is actually quite considerable, even if the actual mechanical ability, so Fuller's Plan 1919, this amazing idea of how we're going to have a certain type of all-arms battle, but heavily used with speedy vehicles, we haven't got the technology available yet. And that's one of these issues that, again, it's cost, but sometimes the aspiration. So, for example, with Fuller and the idea of some of the tank guys in the interwar period saying, you know, we need an only a tank army, it's just not actually achievable, even if you did have the money to blooming well do it in the first place. But the business I think Dick's trying to get at is the tank in World War I is ridiculously crude. If you've been to our museum and you've had a go in these things or sat in it or seen the state of them, you know, it's just bits of armour plate riveted to a framework, a pre-war Daimler engine or a Ricardo engine later on put in the middle of it, and then after that just hope it works and goes for the few hours it's going to be in combat for. But it's the imagination in Britain of what we could be doing to that tank in the future, I think, is quite an important one. Just being, I'm conscious we want to talk World War II, that we did have ideas for the tank in World War I, which are staggeringly forward-looking.
But of course, at the end of the First World War was a war to end all wars, of course, and then there was a 10-year plan. So Britain, just like pretty much everyone else, is sort of downgrading, getting rid of stuff, and a lot of plans that have been put on the, in line have been immediately shelved, haven't they? And then you've got Wall Street crash, 1929, blah 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 blah, and those treasury coffers are starting to kind of thin out.
Right, so let's look at the 1920s.
And you've got a navy to uphold, which is the most expensive bit, and you want to do that in peacetime. And you've got a burgeoning air force. All of which is sort of taking your, not coffers which are already a little bit depleted.
And which will come out in the 1930s during rearmament. But going into the 1920s, we finished the First World War. 24 tank battalions planned or in being in France. About 18, 19 of them were actually in France. A year later, we're down to 5, one of which is a depot battalion. Most of the tanks are being scrapped. The tank corps at this stage is very lucky, A, to survive, and secondly, to be given up to around about 200 eventually of these new tanks, which is the Vickers medium, the Vickers Mark II as it's known. First tank in the world has got an independent suspension. Tanks before that didn't have any form of suspension. So it's got a suspension, it's got a fully revolving turret. It looks like a tank. It's got a 47mm 3-pounder gun. It's got a coaxial machine gun, the first time in the world this has ever been done. The commander's got a cupola for vision purposes. The engine is separate from the driver. It is a modern tank. It's
So quite a lot of thought has been put into that.
Absolutely.
And the right kind of thought.
By Vickers. And this is part of the problem that we're going to come to, is we've reduced the government's ability to design tanks and certainly to control the manufacture of tanks right down. And there's a phrase which you hear again in the 20s and 30s, which is leave it to Vickers. Vickers is a massive armaments firm delivering all sorts of stuff from battleships down to tanks, machine guns. Just let them do it. And they produce a tank which happens to be quite a good tank, but by 1939 is not what you want.
So what happens in the 1930s then?
So I always think that, we at the museum call it the age of experimentation between the wars. Everyone's having a go. They see the potential of the tank. Everyone puts their finger in the water. Very few countries, apart from Russia, build tanks in quantity in the 1930s. So Russia, they import a British export tank from Vickers, the famous 6-tonner, and they build a family of tanks on that. They bring in a tank from Russia, which is the Walter Christie tank, and they build a family of tanks on that with the Christie suspension. So the Russians go their own way, but do build tanks, and Stalin is using the tank, not just as it's part of one of his 5-year plans, etc. as well. In Britain, we've done that experimentation at the end of the 20s up on Salisbury Plain. We did the mechanised force, no doubt. We'll talk about that one, but this idea of experimenting, if you give everybody, not just a tank, but some form of vehicle, small force against a traditional army, this force is winning. That was the interesting thing. And I always look at it that we love the idea, don't we, that the high command is always reactionary, doesn't really like to go forward with new technology and everything. We're complete tosh. Montgomery Massingburg looks at those exercises as head of the army and says, this is the way we want to go. But the key line is 1930, the Great Depression, the money is not there to do it. So, as Dick Slater's book, will be coming out soon, the mechanisation of the cavalry has to be an affair that is done because of the economics of it, slowly, and because of that, ironically, it probably helps Britain because it's done actually sensitively rather than the idea there's a pistol, go and shoot your horse and take your lovely uniform off and get into these filthy oily overalls. The lovely line, I've got to quote it, the cavalry turning to mechanics and filthy things, the line the guy said, we used to love and ride away, but now we screw and bolt.
And also, of course, the sensitive approach of softly kind of getting rid of people's horses didn't work for the Scots Greys, did it? Who wrote a letter to the Times in, I think, 1938, going how outrageous it was that they were expected to get rid of their horses, and couldn't think of anything more louche and gauche and disgusting than being put into a tank.
And 3 years later, in 1941, when they finally got mechanised, they realised that they actually should have mechanised earlier, and there would have been advantage to that. And of course, the commanding officer very nearly got cashiered as a result of doing that. But we've leapt forward. But the point I think to make is in 1930, the time of the Great Depression, 29-30, Britain is still leading the way in terms of the organisation, the tactical development of tanks, and also the physical construction of tanks. We're the best in the world at that stage.
And we're also the leading producer in the world of war material. I mean, there is in the early 1930s, Britain is still producing more war material than any other country at that particular time. It's just that we're not keeping most of it. And also, war material is a very broad brush.
And in terms of tank development, we've got enough money in the coffers from the Treasury in the War Office coffers to produce one experimental model every year, thereabouts. Now that's not a lot, but of course there's no computer modelling in those days or anything like that. They're having to build something and try it out and see what happens. And if it doesn't work, shave a bit of metal off here, change a component there, and see what's better. So we're experimenting very, very slowly. And other countries are looking at us, taking the lessons that we're learning and stealing them for themselves. I'm talking, of course, about the Germans.
Yes, absolutely. But of course, in the 1930s, Britain has a very, very small army, as it traditionally has done. I mean, the First World War is an aberration in terms of having a massive army of sort of millions. That's not the way Britain does things, and a maritime power, an island, and with a seaborne empire and all the rest of it. So that's why the Navy is a senior service, and suddenly you've got this sort of burgeoning Air Force as well coming in, and that's why in 1935, when huge decisions being made about rearmament, Chamberlain favours the Air Force and the Navy above and over the Army. But it does. It also means that when it gets to 1939 and we start creating our alliance with France, France. The deal is that France does the Army bit, and we'll sort of contribute just for kind of political reasons more than anything else. And we'll do the sea power and growing Air Force, but it's not an expectation that we're going to contribute meaningfully on the ground, or certainly not anytime soon. So of course, when France then goes pear-shaped in May, June 1940, then suddenly you've got a problem on your hand because you've lost your ally with a massive great army and you haven't got one.
Can I just ask here, because obviously we're different generations, but the older people probably that are in the room, that view of Chamberlain as the appeaser because of Munich, but also he was quoted as one of the guilty men because of the 1930s stopping. In fact, one of the really interesting ones I find is that Chamberlain's decision about rearmament, so investing in Air Force, Chain Home Command is down, so radar is down to Chamberlain, and the priority of the Air Force and the Navy, because basically if you think Britain's an island, and the logic that was being used, and Chamberlain backs this, is that if the Germans can cross the channel, so in other words, if the Navy's gone, if they can bomb us and land by paratroop troops, the Air Force will have had to be gone. The last resort is the Army. So that's the priority, the way the logic is working. And if you look back, he's absolutely right. He gets it right from that point of view. That actually, so we're talking about tanks, but you always have to see them in a bigger strategic picture. And from backing Chain Home Command, or perhaps getting a few more slightly heavier armoured tanks into service, he did the right thing by getting radar.
Yeah, but it certainly has a knock-on effect into what happens next. So, because the rearmament priorities are going to the Navy and to the Air Force, the existing industrial and technological capacity within Britain is being snapped up. So the really good firms are being snapped up to support those. And Vickers is now working flat out, trying to support the Air Force, and trying to support the Navy. And then finally, when the rearmament money starts to come through for the Army, then the Army at this stage still hasn't got an official continental commitment. It's got no commitment to go and help France. That is, the politicians are really keen that this doesn't happen. So most of the money that goes towards the Army goes into the air defence of Great Britain, the anti-aircraft guns that you see, because people are really concerned about the growing strength of the Luftwaffe. And that money then, which is left within the Army budget, is going to go to, guess what, the more traditional formations, the 4 infantry divisions, and then finally, there's a bit of money left over. So we end up with the money that's left over building a fleet of tanks, but they tend to be light tanks, because light tanks are cheap to build. And it gives us that ability, because we're starting to mechanise the cavalry units, take them off of horses and put them into tanks. It gives us the ability to start doing some form of training, but it's not a warfighting machine.
No, absolutely not. But it's also interesting, isn't it, to look at other tanks around the world. I mean, there just aren't a lot of big tanks. I mean, everyone's very, very fond of talking about the Nazi war machine of the Blitzkrieg years of sort of 1939 to 1941. But actually, it's a complete misnomer because, Germany is way down the list in terms of sort of automotive-ness, if such a word exists, which it doesn't, but you know what I mean. If you look at sort of vehicles per or rather people per vehicle in these populations, I think Italy is something like 106 people per every vehicle. Germany is 47, Britain is 14, I think France is 8, USA is 3. Probably no great surprise on the last one. But 47 for Germany, that's languishing, and of course that's because of the 1920s, and it takes time to catch up and all the rest of it. But there is a knock-on effect of that, which is that you don't have lots of factories, you don't have lots of mechanics, you don't have lots of garages, you don't have lots of people who know how to drive them. And it also means that when you get to actually fighting a war, you're not very mechanised. So one has to remember that of the 135 divisions that Germany attacks on Case Yellow, which is the attack in the Low Countries and the West in May 1940, only 16 of them are motorised, of which only 10 are panzer divisions. So, that's 119 that aren't, and those 119 are using their own kind of 2 feet and horse and cart. And it also means that the tanks they've got are actually predominantly very small. They've got Panzer 1, Panzer 2, Panzer 3 and Panzer 4, but the vast, I think something like 80% of them are Panzer 1s and 2s, and the Czech ones. What's winning? What's smashing the French 1st Armoured Division on the 15th of May 1940 is not tanks on tanks. It's tanks luring bigger French tanks into screens of anti-tank guns, and there's a massive difference.
Yeah, and so the Germans have got exactly the same problem Britain got, as James has just said, loads of light tanks which aren't particularly battle-worthy. But if you're in a battle, and I, as a soldier I can talk about this, if you're in a battle and somebody turns up with a tank and you have no tank, it doesn't matter what that tank is. It's a tank, and it's going to scare you. So, there's almost a thought you can take through to the current day with the plans we've got for the British Army. We don't want to go into that. We want to stick to the Second World War. But, quantity has a quality of its own. One tank can only be in one place at a time. And if we go to war and we don't take our tanks and somebody turns up with a T-34 from 1943, we've got a problem. You have to ask yourself, what was it the technology of the Germans that won them that part of the war? No, it wasn't particularly. Was it the numbers? No, it wasn't, because the British and the French outnumbered the Germans in numbers of tanks. It was the way that they employed not just their tanks, but their whole mentality, their whole doctrine, the whole thought process of how to conduct war.
And comms, which is part of that, obviously, is a massive part of that. But they were able to communicate, aren't they?
Yeah, and the staggering thing about that was, again, back in 1930, we were leading the world in that. There was a time in the 1920s where people simply did not think it was possible to communicate from one tank to another. Certainly not on the move. They just thought it was technologically impossible, and that all the problems associated with it couldn't be overcome. Radio command of tanks, the ability for one tank to talk to another, not just the commander giving orders to the troops, but also the troops spotting something which may be an opportunity for a breakthrough and radioing it back to the commander, is a real force multiplier and a war winner. Actually, during the war, I think Britain has got the edge in radio comms, because a lot of the Germans are on receive only.
Yeah.
But they make use of what they've got. They absolutely do. They've learned the lessons from the experimental mechanised force and experimental armoured force. They work not as tank-only formations, but as all-arms cooperation. The engineers are absolutely key, as are the infantry, gunners less so. But they know how to delegate authority down to the lowest level, make decisions at low level, and get things done. We can't do that.
Well, one really, really interesting statistic is where Germany might be languishing in summer of 1939 in terms of kind of how many vehicles they've got. They're the world leader in personal radios. Astonishingly, more so than the United States. And it's one of those things that seems such a striking anomaly. And then you think about the power of propaganda in the Nazi state. And what they conned onto very early on in the 1930s was the power of communications, the power of a single message. It's Goebbels' great mantra, repeat, repeat, repeat. And this is what they do. And so they have this, they take complete control of all the airwaves. And they put out this sort of constant, and it's not all kind of Hitler ranting and raving. There's even some lighter comedic programs on German radio, which you might find hard to believe, but is true. And it's not all kind of Wagner and marching bands either. There's some sort of lighter stuff as well. But the subliminal message, and sometimes the forceful message, is always exactly the same. We are the best. Aryans are right. Jews are awful. So are commies. We're going to rule the world because we're the champs and we're the best military people in the world. And we've got the best leader in the world. That is the message, which is just repeated over and over and over again. It all starts to seep in. And one of the ways they do this is by developing a thing called the Deutsche Keinempfänger, which is a German little radio. And I actually have one of these at home. It's a really interesting thing. It's about 9 inches by 9 inches, about 4 inches deep. So it's kind of that by that. And that is about as new age and revolutionary as was the iPod when that first came in. I mean, it just completely transformed it. Because if you think about radio sets in the 1920s and 30s, they're absolutely enormous, and they've got sort of, they're kind of got, they're made out of walnut, and they're beautifully made, and they're a middle class and upper class kind of luxury. Whereas what the Nazis did was these ones were made out of Bakelite, and they're they're sort of plastic effectively, and they're super cheap, and everyone can have one. And even if they don't, they kind of put radios and speakers in the stairwells of apartment blocks and in restaurants and in squares and stuff. So there's just no escaping this stuff. And of course, the good folk in the Wehrmacht sort of go, well, hang on a minute, we've got these really small radios that can not only fit in a Panzer I, it could actually fit in a little half track or an Opel Blitz truck or even perhaps one of those BMW RM75s with sidecars, and what that means is suddenly you've got an all-arms motorised unit, the Panzer Division, and they can all communicate with themselves. Genius! Whereas, the French are kind of languishing behind on this, and even the British are a little bit, to a certain extent.
Gamelin, the French Commander-in-Chief, does not actually have a radio set at his headquarters. No. Can you believe that? Actually, it's just quite shocking. He has to send a dispatch rider down to the local post office to forward the messages. In 1940.
Well, yes, and you think about this is the whole problem with the French army. It's incredibly top heavy, stifles initiative because of that that top heavy nature of it. A lot of the French commanders are in their kind of 60s, some like Weygand even in his 70s. So they're just that little bit older. As you get older, you tend to become more conservative, more sort of resistant to change and all the rest of it. Not entirely, but generally speaking. And the big problem is this lack of radio communication. So if you've got sort of overall army in charge, then you've got army groups, then you've got army, then you've got corps, then you've got divisions, then you've got brigades and regiments and battalions and all the rest of it. At every single stage, if you can't communicate by telephone, which you soon can't because Stukas have come over and bombed lots of telephone lines, then you're dependent on dispatch riders. And you send off your dispatch rider at 6 o'clock in the morning from your army group to your army. That doesn't reappear until 9, if it does reappear, by which point the whole situation completely changes, and you're trying to repeat that at every step of the way. You can see why the French army, for the most part, just gets completely stuck in cement. Meanwhile, the Germans, who can all communicate themselves with their spearhead, can sort of beetle around, and at the point of impact, they can still have that superiority in firepower and force that they so desperately need when you're attacking. And that's basically in a nutshell how it does it.
Nobody expected the Germans to attack the French. The French are the most powerful army in Europe.
Yeah.
That everybody rates them. The Germans would be mad to actually attack them, particularly when they're reinforced by the British. So the Allies, if I can call them that, end up fighting not the war that they expected to fight, which was more akin to 1918, or probably 1916. But suddenly this blitzkrieg for the shorthand for what the Germans do takes them completely by surprise. And they haven't got the mindset, they haven't got the communications, they haven't got anything to allow them to cope with the problem they're presented with.
Should we just take it back to tanks? Because for Britain at the end of the 30s, it is odd when you look at that why have we got 1,000 light Mark 6B tanks going into service? And part of that is this rearmament issue. Is a light 6B is a good tank to introduce factories in how to make tanks. So we kept doing, and what's the phrase, continuation orders as well, to keep the factory going. So it's to get these new factories that are having a go at building a tank because they're already being snapped up by the Air Force or these other key providers. And that's one of the reasons we have so many of a light model tank. Having said that, we were able to do with the Matilda 2, as the example, go to the Vulcan Works, they actually learn how to make a tank for the first time and do that relatively quickly for about 3 years. So we were able to do that, and I'd recommend Dick Haynes' manual on the Matilda 2. If you haven't got it, you've got your copy with you, haven't you? So the idea was, in Britain in the late 30s, it's how you get those things going, but it's also in terms of production with the tank, but also just background as well. If you're not tank nerds, we end up with 3 main types for Britain. Is the idea of the light tank for reconnaissance. Often that was given to the cavalry, screening, etc. The infantry tank, the thicker armoured, think World War I, helping the infantry to advance on a prepared position, crushing the barbed wire, etc. And then a cruiser tank to go through the gap. And again, at the back of it's only from the mid-30s onwards that we start thinking of the Germans as the big problem. Earlier, we've been thinking of our orders for cruisers increase because we think it's going to be the Italians in the Western Desert. So, again, that's another thing. We've got the benefit of hindsight. We see it's Hitler's big threat. Earlier 30s, mid-30s, they're still worrying about Mussolini and the threat out in the desert, where you're not going to need infantry tanks so much. So the changes of priorities change for the British Army depending on who they think they're also going to fight. So the number of orders that go in change that way too.
But also, I mean, if you look at big tanks in 1939 to 1940, I mean, who's got them? You've got the Sharpies, which are pretty big. Then there's the we were talking about earlier on. We've got the Panzer VI, not to be confused with the Tiger. I mean, basically looks a bit like a
Six made.
Yeah, six made. One of them, a couple of them served in Norway,
Yeah.
but they're abandoned. So and the French have the big tank and they get beat. So.
The Russians have these copies of Independent, these sort of land battleship things, but the truth is the generation that's fighting in 1940, and really, the German army says we'll be ready for war in 42, the Italian army is doing a 5-year plan for 1938 to build tanks and build other equipment into that. The war starts too soon for the German and the Italian military, just as we think it does for us, as it were. We're not quite ready, but hang on a second. So the idea of the war plans, etc., Hitler in 1939 is taking steel production away from tanks because he thinks it's going to be like World War One. It's only Manstein's plan that changes all that then he likes tanks as propaganda. 1940 and the German success with their tanks changes it all.
And the critical point that everybody needs to understand about this is what happened post Dunkirk. And I think those of you who are here this morning, the point I made was this. When we evacuated 339,000 troops from, a lot of them French, from Dunkirk, how many tanks did we bring back from the BEF? I think the answer was 19. Most people think it's 0. We managed to get 19 back. How many captured German tanks did we take back with us for evaluation? Answer?
0.
0. Absolutely none. So we had no idea what it was that beat us. So Tommy, who's been evacuated, what happened? Oh, German tanks everywhere. And he sees what we think is a pretty pathetic Panzer I or Panzer II, 2-man, 3-man tank. But to him, it's a huge behemoth monster that, crushes all before it. And it's this myth of the Blitzkrieg, this myth of German invincibility due to technical prowess and better tanks comes about. But the key thing to remember with this is the other side of the coin. All the tanks that we took, the 700 odd tanks that we took to France, the ones that weren't totally destroyed fell into the hands of the Germans. So they had the chance to look at every single tank that we'd built, every type of tank, and evaluate it. They knew what the guns were doing, they knew how much ammunition they carried, the armour it carried. So the first thing they did was said, we've got to up armour our medium tanks, our Panzer IIIs and our Panzer IVs. On our battle tank of the time, the Panzer III, we need to go from a 37mm gun to a 50mm gun, which they started doing at the end of 1940. So by the time we next come into action against the Germans in February 1941 with Rommel and the Africa Corps, they've stolen a huge technological march on us.
Yeah, so let's just talk about Matilda too, shall we? So, in a nutshell, what do you think of it?
I do my bit about what I'm very keen on. There's a battle. The British do one. 1940, we are talking tanks still, please, honestly. But the plan was the BEF and the best of the French mobile divisions were going to go into Belgium because we thought the Germans were coming that way because they did in World War One. That was the general gist of it. The Germans don't. They go through the Ardennes forest, go round below and sort of head to the coast. The British come back. We put one tank attack in successfully at a place called Arras, and they drive down and they cut across basically the rear elements of the 7th Panzer Division. And in that attack, to me, it's really, really significant one because Hitler is nervous. He's a First World War soldier. He remembers the Battle of the Marne. The Germans were about to win in the first Schlieffen Plan attack in World War One, and the Battle of the Marne steals the victory right at the end, when they thought they were just about to win. Hitler's worried about that, so he actually calls a 24-hour halt after this attack by the British at Arras, which is using Matilda 1s and Matilda 2 tanks. And post-battle reports about those, much later, actually influence Hitler, seeing these reports of their standard 37mm anti-tank guns bouncing off the thick armour of the Matilda 2. And even the Matilda 1 had got thick armour on as well. And that's what triggers Hitler to then order the famous Tiger programme that leads to the Tiger tank. So this attack has a lot of significance in a number of ways. But the 24-hour halt, and why credit to the Matilda II for this, they break down, they are shot up. Rommel famously gets all the flak 88mm guns to shoot them up. The French end up getting fired on by our guys as well. All sorts of things go wrong. But it frightens the Germans enough that Hitler does call this halt. We overnight then reinforce the Channel ports, and that means that actually we've got places to go back to. If the Germans had kept going for that 24 hours, they would have got to the coast and the Channel ports, and Churchill would have probably had to do his moment of negotiating with Hitler because we'd lost the army. So there's moments of significance here, and I would argue the Matilda II is a key moment of that, because actually the Germans didn't have much to fire against it at that particular time. It's only when they start using their flak guns, which are already issued with an anti-tank round, because again, the Germans are not stupid, they've got these anti-aircraft guns, we might use those to batter our way through the Maginot Line, so we'll give them a solid metal shot, armour piercing, to chip away at the concrete and get through that way. So Rommel gets them to use those, and there's the idea of putting the 88 on the Tiger, etc. as well. So I'm all for the Matilda II. I think it's a great one. O'Connor's victory in the Western Desert, which is just stunning. We always forget that. 25,000 British soldiers, cream of Italian army, Operation Compass, 250,000 Italians defeated. By using, ironically, slow tanks like the Matilda to go trundling across the desert and cut off a retreating Italian army that's slogging it back across on foot, sort of thing, on the whole. So this has a moment that, because again, kaleidoscoping history, we always tend to look at the bigger German tanks coming next, and that clouds our vision of some of the things that go on with the earlier ones.
But also, it's very interesting because both the British and the Germans are both kind of sort of completely re-examining tank design at the beginning of 1942, and the British is because Operation Crusader hasn't gone quite as well as they hoped. It hasn't been the kind of it's been a victory, but it hasn't been the overwhelming victory that they hoped it would be, and they're already starting to get sort of a bit apprehensive about the kind of the dexterousness of the Deutsche Afrika Korps. Whereas obviously in the Eastern Front, Germany has been kind of halted outside Moscow, and suddenly these T-34s are appearing on the scene, and so it's interesting because the briefings are done very very similar periods. This is what we reckon we need, and from the British point of view, it's kind of mechanical reliability, ease of maintenance first, and then gun and armour. Whereas for the Germans, it's gun first, then armour, and kind of ease of maintenance and reliability comes a long way down the list. And it is amazing how those lists come to kind of actually be such a key part of tank design pretty much till pretty much the end of the war, don't they?
Yeah, but we don't stumble upon the problem of reliability initially, because as we go back to 1939, we've got so few of these new cruiser tanks particularly that we've literally just built. The first versions, the A9 and the A10, have had problems in trials, so we suspect that they're not going to be too good, but we only build 100 or so of each. But we've got a new cruiser, the A13, coming out, which has got a Christie suspension, and we think that this is going to be it. But we then fall into this horrible pit of unreliable tanks. There's no point in having a really good tank if it breaks down every 10 minutes and it doesn't actually make it onto the start line. And that's
which ones are the kind of the horror stories?
The simpler the tank, the more reliable it is in broad terms. So
because tanks are incredibly complex, so you want to keep a complex thing as simple as you possibly can.
So the Vickers Light and the Matilda I, which are built down for a price, are relatively simple and therefore less prone to breaking down and more able to be mended. But then we start, it's engine design, air filtration, specialist areas like that we don't actually know very much about because we haven't had the money in the 1930s to experiment very much with it. Starts causing us problems. Build quality is another one because we've got firms. Now remember I said at the start of rearmament, the best industrial and technological capacity in Britain goes to the Navy and goes to the Air Force because they can throw the money at the problem and start buying up the contracts. So the Army, the firms that are building tanks are, with one exception, which is Nuffield Mechanisation and Aero, Lord Nuffield's own pet project to build tanks with a Christie design. With the exception of that, these are semi-failing industrial concerns which we use because we've got no choice. And they're designing the tanks. And they design the tanks to suit their own factories and their own plants and their own workforces. And that means that each tank is effectively built by hand. but the build quality is absolutely appalling. We ship them, I know we were talking about shipping earlier on, we ship them out on the decks of ships to the Middle East with not even a tarpaulin over the top of them, or we put them into the holds of ships and we don't secure them so they'll smash into each other across the Bay of Biscay. And then, but the bottom line is reliability. We have a reliability crisis by 1942. We can't get a tank that can actually keep going in the way that the Germans can. The other issue that comes into it is our existing tanks cannot be improved in the way that the Germans can. More by luck than judgment, their Panzer III and their Panzer IV have got big enough turret rings to allow them to fit bigger turrets, but more importantly, bigger guns and bigger ammunition in a way that we can't do. Because we've always, some of you, just out of interest, how many of you heard of the rail gauge problem?
Yeah.
Okay, what it was, the rail gauge in Britain gives you a maximum width of a rail wagon. And we were absolutely convinced that all our tanks must be able to fit onto a rail wagon, go across bridges, through tunnels and all the rest of it. So that gave us a defined maximum size to the width of the tank, which gives us a defined maximum size to the size of the gun you can carry. Which, when the 2-pounder was the best anti-tank gun in the world, which it was in 1940, was fine, but by 1941 the Germans had up-armoured and it was no longer the best, and we needed a bigger gun. And we found it very difficult to shoehorn the next generation anti-tank gun, the 6-pounder, into the existing designs. So we had nowhere to go with our designs. And of course the other thing is, post-Dunkirk, we have a great tank crisis, which is we've got to build tanks because we're fearing invasion, and we haven't really spoke about that. So Britain genuinely believes it could be invaded in the autumn of 1940 and spring of 1941. So build what we've got. We can't afford to get stuck into trying to put improvements into production because it will slow things down. Exactly the same thing happened with the 2-pounder anti-tank gun. So we end up producing effectively tanks which we know or suspect to be obsolete simply because we need the quantity. And it's only when in about 1942 we can take a breath and look at tank design again that this whole issue of the importance of reliability and ergonomics comes into play.
Yeah, David Fletcher makes a good point as well, which is the other one, which is when you've got a peacetime army that has a lot of time to train and to prepare, their mechanical ability, so the tank corps were very, very good at what they're doing. A wartime army is suddenly lots of conscripts, lots of people coming in. So their ability to maintain their own vehicles goes down as well. So there's criticisms that where sometimes some of the vehicles, yes, they're not particularly well made, but they're also not being maintained as well as they should be by people who will know that that engine sound means I better stop now and have a fiddle, rather than people who are not that familiar with it and they keep driving and therefore things fail.
But that starts to change quite radically, doesn't it? Particularly with the British Army. I mean, by 1944, you've got REME, you've got light aid detachments, you've got mobile workshops, you've got all that. The technical support and maintenance in the field is second to none, really, isn't it?
Probably forced by the whole reliability problem.
Yeah, I'm sure, absolutely.
We don't build recovery vehicles because we want to. We build them because we have to recover lots of vehicles. And that pays dividends in Normandy in 1944 because we've got a great logistic echelon system. We know how to move ammunition and fuel around the battlefield. We know how to recover tanks. But 80% of the Shermans that were knocked out in 44-45 would have been recovered, repaired and put back into action because they weren't burnt out, knocked out, on fire, ammunition exploding. If you're a tank crewman, the first time that you hear a clunk of metal as somebody fires and hits you, you're out. You bail out. You don't ask questions. That's certainly.
This is. I mean, I did say jokingly at the beginning that maybe we'd only get to 1942 in 3/4 an hour, and actually we've only got about 5 minutes left, and we haven't really got. So this is my stab to get us into 1944. I mean, it is really interesting about you take Operation Goodwood. I mean, generations of historians have done this and sort of finger wagged how awful the British were and how terrible they were. They lost 400 tanks in one day. Well, actually, it was 493, so it was even worse. But they didn't. But exactly your point. It needs qualifying because what a lot of people forget is that within 24 hours, 225 of those were back in action. Within 48 hours, a further kind of 68, and I think only about 121 or something were permanent write-offs. 121 is quite a lot, but it's not when you've got 3,500 already in theatre. And it is that ability to be able to maintain in the field and beetle around the battlefield because you're retaining the battlefield. And sending in your armoured recovery vehicles, your ARVs at night to kind of whisk all this stuff and get it back into action. I mean, the 2nd Battalion of the Northamptonshire Yeomanry, they lose something like 34 tanks on the first day of Operation Goodwood, the 18th of July 1944. But by the 30th of July, just 12 days later, they're fully back up to strength and good to go for Operation Bluecoat.
And if those figures
that's
sound
quite
terrible,
something.
bear in mind that 2NY only took part on the first day of Goodwood in the evening. They didn't start on. They weren't the first to start.
Exactly.
It was 23rd Armoured Brigade, 29th Armoured Brigade. So,
but that stuff is really, really important, and it's a kind of forgotten bit that people don't really appreciate. I mean, a Sherman engine could be whipped out and another one put in 2 hours in the field if you needed to. Yeah. That's really
I think
something.
Also that's another thing, which is again the bigger picture. The tank, because we're talking tanks, is only part of that field force, etc. Why Montgomery's using so much armour at Goodwood is he doesn't have enough infantry and realise his infantry are diminishing resource anyway. So he goes very tank heavy for certain types of engagements that in another time might not have necessarily been the case. So some of these things that where we're, I was talking out earlier about us, the terrible tendency to value judge one against one. What were the Germans doing compared to what we did is a real problem, because immediately you've got to put all these qualifiers in place about, what is it? What was the aim? The fact we were equipment rich and the Americans were able to supply us with so many Shermans that we could afford to do that in a manner that the Germans were never going to be able to fight in that way of being actually that sort of amount of tanks to be that sacrificial. So often when you're looking at our topic, look at that wider context, because when we were talking out the front there as well, just looking at the physical tank in front of you and therefore doing the top trumps against what the enemy tank was doing. That just wasn't what they ever do in World War II. You never one against one tank engagement. It's very, very, very rare. So think about, how are they being used? Fire support. Most of the time not fighting other tanks, helping the infantry advance, doing all these other things massively successfully, and then all of a sudden we see one in tank engagement, and because the Sherman comes off worse, as if like something else.
And I think also that you have to appreciate that when you're dealing with tanks, there's all sorts of payoffs, and there's all sorts of different situations which affect different combatant nations in their decision-making process. So, for example, there was an argument for having M26 Pershings in 1944 in Normandy. Problem with that is they're really, really big, and you're going forward. If you're going forward and your enemy is retreating, what's your enemy going to do when it comes to a bridge? Either it's already been bombed and destroyed by the British Air Force, the Allied Air Forces before the battle, or if it is still there, it's not going to be there by the time the Germans have got across it. So you've then got to bridge that. The easiest, quickest way to bridge it is a Class 40 Bailey Bridge, which takes 40 tons. So there's no point having a 50-ton tank because it's not going to be able to get across it. Similarly, if you have Pershings, they're substantially bigger than a Sherman tank, or even a Cromwell, or even a Churchill, for that matter. So you've got to ship them. So that means they take up more shipping space. They take more shipping space on a landing craft tank, or a landing ship tank, or indeed a Liberty ship going across the Atlantic. And so it's always a question of choices. Whereas if you've got lots and lots of Shermans, you know that the chances are it's not going to have much tank-on-tank engagement. And for 95% or 92% of its operations, it's going to be absolutely fine for what it needs to do. And it's reliable, and you've got people who already know how to do it. So it's a quartermaster's dream because you've got lots and lots of them. Whereas if you have lots of different types of tanks, then you've got the quartermaster has had lots of different gaskets and distributor heads and other bits and pieces that you need to put in these different tanks. So you want to keep that thing as simple as possible. The flip side of that is it's a Sherman, so therefore it can only have a limited size gun and it's only going to have limited size armour. And that's the payoff. But there's always a question of one and the other. And when you then look at a Tiger and a Panther, great, it's massive armour and it's huge and it's got a fantastically scary gun on it. But that also comes with problems because it's more complicated mechanically, it's harder to repair in the field, takes more fuel, which the Germans haven't got anyway. So do you see what I mean? I mean, it's not a question of lining two tanks up on a football pitch and going, who's got the bigger gun?
Can I be optimistic? Sorry, Dick, I'm just going to do this one. We always get to the end of the war, don't we? And we've forgotten the fact that actually in Britain we come out with a world-beating tank for the next 20 years that just misses the end of the war by a couple of weeks. And even prior to that, the Cromwell does rather well. And dare I say, we haven't mentioned some of these weird things about like engines, the fact that Rowbottom gets the Merlin off the Spitfire and whatever, changes it, derates it, becomes a Meteor, suddenly 650 horsepower engine that suddenly makes a Cromwell. Again, we go further and faster from crossing the Seine to the Dutch border. in a faster time than the Germans did. We always talk about the Germans advanced blitzkrieg in 1940. We did that way quicker and further than they did. Okay, so that was because we had tanks like the Cromwell and tanks like the Sherman that were relatively speedy and fast, and the Cromwell certainly because of the Meteor. We then have the Comet, which again has got a 77mm Vickers gun on, which has got better penetration capacity than with firing discarding sabot than the Panther's gun. That does see service in early 45, and then of course the famous Centurion, which just misses the end of the war by 6 weeks, becomes the best tank in the world for the next 20 years. So it's a tricky one to say, you know, but actually our tank design, there's a very good reason we have that problem in the middle. The Americans fill the gap with the Sherman, but our own tank design gets very good again at the end of the war. And I know you don't want to talk about the modern era. I just throw in industry. Why is the Centurion such a great tank? Because they got the Department of Tank Design. They got the expertise there. Instead of giving it out to industry, they designed it themselves, and we come up with a Centurion. And you know, there's even debates in MOD at the moment. We gave it all out to industry with our recent vehicle programs. Should we take it back in-house and come up with something we actually really want to get? Okay, I'll stop you there. Go on.
Right. Remember David said earlier on that we entered the war and we had these three classes of tanks. Light tank, which was used for reconnaissance, had specialist roles, fine. But we had these two other main categories of tank. The cruiser tank, which was the fast, lightly armoured thing for breakout and exploitation, and the heavy armoured infantry support tank. By about 1943, people were questioning, quite rightly, whether or not this artificial breakdown into two roles was correct. Because you could guarantee that the wrong tank was in the wrong place at the wrong time, you know. And so therefore what you wanted was what people variously call either a capital or a universal tank. And Montgomery, I'm a great fan of Montgomery. I don't happily have fought under him. Montgomery had this idea. He liked a tidy battlefield. You know, he had that thing about balance and tidying up the battlefield. He wouldn't fight until he was ready. But he had this idea that he wanted one type of tank, and he saw it as the tank that had done a good service in 1942, 1943, which was the Sherman. When he went into Normandy, he didn't want to take the British Cromwell, the new British Cromwell in. He didn't want to take the Churchill in, the infantry tank at all. He was quite happy to take the risks. And a lot of people were saying, the concept is fine, but you haven't got the tank built to get the balance wasn't right with the Sherman. It was quite fast, but it was undergunned and it was fairly thinly armoured. You can never make a tank that's invulnerable. We talked about that earlier on, but you can get a better balanced tank, and that's where the Centurion just happens to be right. That the balance somehow, by luck or judgment, comes out right, but it's too late for the end of the war. So. There's so many things that we do well in Britain. Ammunition design we're really good at. Transmission and gearbox design we're really good at. The design and development of specialist armoured vehicles, 79th Armoured Division, famous funnies, with all the specialist roles that you do need. So your flamethrowers and your swimming tanks and your bridge layers. We're still world beaters at that. You know, we absolutely get that right. But for the reasons we've already spoke about, you know, it takes us until 1945 to come up with a tank that would have been the best. You know, it would have been better than the German Panther in so many ways, but we can't deploy it quite in time to have any effect on the war.